Archduchess Sophie of Austria entered the Habsburg court as a brilliant Bavarian princess, sharp-minded, disciplined, and destined to shape the fate of empires. She forged emperors with her own hands, steered ministers like pieces on a chessboard, and became the silent engine behind one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. But power came with a price no crown could shield her from. 2 sons lost, a daughter-in-law who became her enemy, an empire she had devoted her life to safeguarding slowly unraveling before her eyes. Sophie was a woman who held the monarchy together with sheer will, yet lived long enough to watch the pillars she built crumble one by one. Her life is not just the story of a Habsburg matriarch, it is the tragedy of a mother who outlived her victories, her children, and her empire. Sophie of Bavaria entered the world in 1805, at a moment when Europe was being reshaped by the ambitions of emperors, the exhaustion of old monarchies, and the looming shadow of Napoleon's conquests. Born into the distinguished Wittelsbach dynasty, she spent her earliest years in the palaces of Munich, where the air smelled of polished wood, incense from morning mass, and the faint metallic tang of military ceremony. Her father, King Maximilian the Joseph, governed Bavaria with an unusual blend of pragmatism and reformist energy. Rather than clinging to rigid tradition, he embraced modernization, encouraged intellectual life, and believed that a dynasty's future depended not on fear, but on competence. Her mother, Caroline of Baden, provided something rarer still: affection, education, and an environment in which daughters were expected to think, to observe, and to carry themselves with the confidence normally reserved for sons. Under her guidance, Sophie learned French, history, philosophy, and courtly etiquette. But she also developed something far more valuable: a clear-eyed understanding that power often flowed through conversations behind doors, not through the crowns glittering above them. As a young girl, she was known for her sharp intelligence, her composure, and her ability to read people with unsettling accuracy. Those who visited the Bavarian court noticed her seriousness, her quick wit, and her calm presence. She lacked the frivolity of many aristocratic daughters. Instead, she paid attention to how ministers spoke, how her father negotiated with foreign envoys, and how her mother navigated the delicate tensions of court alliances. Without ever being told explicitly, Sophie absorbed an early and fundamental lesson: that monarchy was a performance requiring discipline, patience, and an almost ruthless clarity of purpose. It was a lesson she would carry with her throughout her life, and one that would later shape the destiny of the Habsburg Empire itself. When Sophie married Archduke Franz Karl of Austria in 1824, the transition was abrupt and disorienting. Bavaria had been warm, intellectually vibrant, and modernizing. Vienna, at least the Vienna of the imperial court, felt frozen in time. The Habsburg monarchy, despite its vast territories and centuries of prestige, still clung to rigid traditions, suffocating ceremony, and institutions that had barely evolved since the 18th century. The court valued obedience over imagination, hierarchy over merit, and silence over honesty. For Sophie, this was not merely a change of husband or residence. It was a descent into a world where every gesture mattered, where every decision was filtered through layers of protocol, and where a young archduchess was expected to exist as a decorative ornament rather than an active political presence. Her husband, Franz Karl, was kind, pious, and gentle, but he was also painfully passive. He avoided conflict, deferred to others, and showed little interest in exerting political influence. In Bavaria, Sophie had watched her parents govern with deliberation and thoughtfulness. In Vienna, she found herself married to a man who seemed entirely unsuited for the demands of imperial responsibility. This mismatch became immediately apparent to her. and it stirred a sense of determination that would define her role in the Habsburg court. If Franz Karl would not step into the position expected of him, then she would, quietly, subtly, but decisively. The Viennese court initially underestimated her. To them, she was merely another foreign bride, expected to adapt to Habsburg customs, bear children, and embody docile virtue. Yet within her first few years in Vienna, Sophie revealed a new dimension of herself, one that Bavaria had only hinted at. She possessed a remarkable aptitude for understanding political dynamics, reading state documents, and analyzing international affairs. What others regarded as ceremonial obligations, she viewed as opportunities to assess power, cultivate alliances, and understand the vulnerabilities of the empire she now belonged to. Unlike her husband, she refused to drift in the currents of court life. She intended to shape them. She also encountered a court still recovering from decades of war, social upheaval, and diplomatic anxiety. The Napoleonic Wars had left Austria exhausted, financially strained, and politically cautious. The empire was vast but fragile, bound together not by shared identity but by old treaties, dynastic marriages, and carefully maintained illusions of stability. Sophie recognized these weaknesses with startling clarity. She observed how ministers feared innovation, how aristocrats clung to outdated privileges, and how the empire relied on its sheer size to mask its internal fractures. She understood, far earlier than most, that the Habsburg survival required discipline, unity, and a more competent leadership than the one currently provided by Emperor Ferdinand I. By the time she gave birth to her first child, Sophie had transformed into a figure far more formidable than Vienna had expected. She became a quiet force in the background of imperial politics, never officially acknowledged, never formally empowered, yet impossible to ignore. Ministers noticed her. Diplomats respected her. Foreign courts began to speak of her intelligence with a mixture of admiration and caution. She was not an empress, but she carried herself as though she were one, and she understood that her greatest influence would come not from titles, but from the son she intended to raise to rule. In stepping into the Habsburg world, Sophie had not simply married into a dynasty. She had entered a battlefield cloaked in ceremony. And she was determined, calmly, resolutely, and without apology, to win. In the early years of her life in Vienna, Sophie discovered something that would define her destiny: the quiet vacuum of leadership at the heart of the Habsburg court. The empire was grand in appearance, but hollow in discipline, magnificent in ceremony, but fragile in governance. Emperor Ferdinand I, gentle but incapacitated, struggled with health issues that left him unable to manage the complexities of statecraft. His ministers moved cautiously, often timidly, preserving routines rather than confronting the challenges facing a continent reshaped by revolution and nationalism. In this environment, Sophie's mind, sharp, analytical, and restless, found both its greatest frustration and its greatest opportunity. She began, almost instinctively, to study the machinery of the empire she had married into. She read state papers late into the night, analyzing military reports, diplomatic correspondence, and financial accounts with a precision that surpassed even experienced bureaucrats. She learned the subtleties of each minister's temperament. Which ones could be persuaded, which ones resisted change, which ones secretly feared the empire's weaknesses but dared not speak them aloud. In a court where appearances mattered more than competence, Sophie quietly became the most competent person in the room. What set her apart was not only intelligence, but clarity. She understood that the Austrian Empire, sprawling, multilingual, and politically diverse, required a level of discipline and strategic vision that few of its leaders possessed. She had seen, in Bavaria, the benefits of modernization. She had watched her father govern with decisiveness, and she sensed that time was running out for monarchies that refused to adapt. The Habsburgs existed within a world shifting beneath their feet. Nationalism was rising in Hungary, liberal ideas were spreading among students and intellectuals, and foreign powers were testing Austria's strength. Yet in Vienna, fear of change caused paralysis. It was this paralysis that Sophie vowed to break. Her partnership with Clemens von Metternich, the famed Austrian statesman, became a turning point. Metternich recognized her intellect almost immediately. In private correspondence, he remarked that Sophie possessed the mind of a statesman in the body of an archduchess, a phrase that circulated among diplomats with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. They exchanged ideas on European stability, on the delicate balance between tradition and reform, and on the strategies necessary to preserve Austria's influence in a rapidly transforming continent. Metternich was impressed, not merely by her grasp of policy, but by her ability to see beyond documents into the human motives behind them. Yet despite this growing influence, Sophie remained officially powerless. The laws of the empire did not allow an archduchess, especially one not born into the Habsburg line, to participate formally in governance. She had no seat at the council table, no authority to sign decrees, and no formal role in state affairs. But power in monarchies is often less about position and more about proximity. And Sophie, by positioning herself as the intellectual anchor of her family, acquired a form of influence that no title could grant. She learned to exercise authority through gentle questions, subtle suggestions, and carefully timed conversations. She never issued commands. Instead, she illuminated consequences. Ministers who dismissed her at first found themselves increasingly unable to ignore her observations. Diplomatic envoys who underestimated her soon realized that she knew more about the political climate of Europe than many of the men appointed to analyze it. Even foreign courts, hearing reports from Vienna, began referring to her not as Franz Karl's wife, but as the real empress, a figure whose presence shaped the mood of the palace, even though her name appeared nowhere in official documents. This informal power grew more visible as her family expanded. With the birth of her son Franz Joseph in 1830, Sophie's sense of purpose crystallized into a mission. She did not intend to raise him as a comfortable aristocrat or a ceremonial prince. She intended to raise him as a ruler, disciplined, obedient, and unwaveringly committed to the continuity of the monarchy. From the earliest days of his childhood, she observed him with the eye of a strategist, noting his strengths, correcting his weaknesses, and ensuring that he absorbed the habits of duty ingrained so deeply in her own upbringing. Working quietly behind the walls of palaces, Sophie began shaping not only her son, but the very future she believed he was destined to inherit. She attended audiences with foreign dignitaries, not as a passive consort, but as an interpreter of political intent. She traveled to imperial estates to better understand the realities of governance. She advised her husband on matters he struggled to grasp, often drafting letters and documents in his name. In doing so, she became the silent architect of the empire's internal coherence, a role that would eventually spill into the public sphere when the empire found itself on the brink of collapse in 1848. Yet even as her influence expanded, Sophie remained constrained by the expectations of her gender and position. She was admired but also resented, respected but quietly feared. Some courtiers whispered that she was too ambitious for a woman, others that she manipulated her husband, and still others that she envisioned a future in which her son, rather than the sitting emperor, would rise to power. Though these rumors were exaggerated at first, they contained a grain of truth. Sophie did see weaknesses in the current leadership. She did believe Franz Joseph was better suited for the throne. And she did understand that crises often open doors that remained shut in times of stability. By the mid-1840s, Sophie had become a paradox, a woman without formal authority who nevertheless shaped the currents of imperial politics, a mother whose influence extended far beyond her children, and a strategist whose foresight was keen enough to sense that Europe was headed toward a storm. She was preparing, not openly, but in the quiet discipline of the palace, for a moment when the empire would need someone capable of decisive action. That moment would arrive sooner than anyone expected. By the time the year 1848 arrived, Sophie had spent more than 2 decades studying the fragile machinery of the Habsburg monarchy. She had watched emperors hesitate, ministers cling to outdated routines, and aristocrats ignore the tremors of discontent rising from universities, marketplaces, and provincial towns. She sensed, earlier than most, that the empire was standing on a precipice. Europe was a furnace waiting for a spark. Ideas of constitutional government, national self-determination, and social reform moved rapidly across borders, circulating through pamphlets, clandestine meetings, and whispered conversations. The continent was changing, and monarchies unprepared for this tide would find themselves swept aside. Sophie recognized the pattern with chilling clarity, for she understood politics not as a series of isolated events, but as a long, accumulating pressure that demanded release. When the revolutions finally erupted, first in France, then across Italy, Germany, Hungary, and Austria, they struck the Habsburg Empire with the force of 1,000 storms. Vienna, usually a city of carefully choreographed ceremony, transformed into a battleground of competing demands. Students marched in protest, shouting for freedom of the press. Workers joined them, calling for labor protections. Hungarian nobles demanded autonomy, Czech leaders demanded recognition, and Italian territories threatened to defect entirely. The empire's vastness, once its pride, exposed itself as a vulnerability. Every region had its own grievance, every language its own frustrated cry. Emperor Ferdinand I, already overwhelmed by the complexities of leadership in calm times, found himself unable to respond to a crisis of this magnitude. He was gentle, well-meaning, but paralyzed by illness and indecision. His ministers, long accustomed to hesitation, fractured under pressure. Metternich, the architect of post-Napoleonic Europe and one of Sophie's closest allies, was forced into exile as revolutionaries stormed the streets. For a moment, it seemed as though the Habsburg monarchy, the ancient house that had survived religious wars, continental conflicts, and centuries of political storms, might finally collapse. Sophie refused to let that happen. She saw, with a clarity unclouded by panic, that the empire needed a new center of gravity. Someone young enough to inspire confidence, disciplined enough to impose order, and resilient enough to confront a Europe remade by revolution. She also knew that such a figure was not her husband Franz Karl, who lacked the resolve and ambition necessary in a moment of national upheaval. She had long understood his limitations, but in 1848, those limitations became a threat to the monarchy itself. The empire did not need a gentleman who avoided conflict. It needed a ruler forged by the very discipline she had spent years cultivating in her eldest son, Franz Joseph. He was 18 years old, steeped in training, molded by Sophie's expectations, and shaped by a lifetime of preparation that had begun the moment she first held him in her arms. He had internalized her lessons of duty, obedience, and emotional restraint. He possessed the polished manners of a court prince, the work ethic of a soldier. and the unshakable belief that monarchy was not merely a birthright, but a sacred obligation. In him, Sophie saw not just a son, but the destiny of a crumbling empire. But placing him on the throne required a political maneuver of breathtaking delicacy. Ferdinand still ruled, and Franz Karl, as his younger brother, was the official heir presumptive. Any attempt to bypass this succession risked scandal, backlash, or accusations of treason. Sophie therefore moved with subtlety, patience, and a strategist's understanding of timing. She held private discussions with ministers who doubted Franz Karl's ability to govern. She spoke quietly with members of the imperial family, planting the seed of an idea that seemed unthinkable at first, but increasingly necessary. The empire needed a young emperor. She reminded Franz Karl, gently but persistently, that the crown would destroy him, that he was not made for the burdens it required, and that accepting it would not only endanger the empire, but crush him under expectations he could never fulfill. She framed the decision not as ambition, but as duty, a sacrifice for the good of the dynasty. Franz Karl, who respected her judgment, eventually accepted this reasoning. He stepped aside without protest, signing away his claim with the calm resignation of a man who knew he was not meant for the throne. On December 2, 1848, the moment Sophie had quietly orchestrated came to pass. Emperor Ferdinand abdicated. Franz Karl renounced his rights, and Franz Joseph, barely more than a boy, was proclaimed Emperor of Austria. The room in which the ceremony took place was solemn and dim, heavy with the weight of history. Ministers stood rigid, uncertain whether this young man could save the monarchy. Courtiers whispered prayers under their breath. Outside, the city crackled with unrest, but inside the palace, a new chapter of the empire had begun. As the crown passed onto her son's head, Sophie remained composed, though those close to her noted the flicker of fierce determination in her eyes. She had succeeded where few women of her time could even imagine acting. She had preserved the dynasty through intellect rather than inheritance, through strategy rather than spectacle. And although she never wore a crown, her influence in that moment was unmistakable. The revolution had reshaped Europe, but Sophie had reshaped the Habsburg Empire. She had seized a moment no one else dared to see, and in doing so, she became not just a mother of emperors, but the architect of a reign that would last nearly 7 decades. When Franz Joseph ascended the throne in 1848, he did so not as a symbol of youthful promise, but as a creature shaped, almost sculpted, by his mother's relentless vision. Sophie's influence over her eldest son was profound, overwhelming, and meticulously cultivated. From childhood, he had been trained to view monarchy not as privilege, but as burden, not as a glittering destiny, but as a duty carved into the bone. And now, crowned in the midst of revolution, he stepped into a life that would demand every ounce of discipline Sophie had instilled in him. She remained at his side in those early years of his reign, acting as advisor, guardian, and silent co-regent. Ministers came to understand that speaking to the young emperor often meant navigating the intellectual shadow of his mother as well. Sophie attended state councils, listened to reports with a piercing gaze, and afterward offered private instruction to Franz Joseph, guiding him on which ministers could be trusted, which generals were reliable, and which decisions were necessary for the empire's survival. She was not merely involved, she was indispensable. The court, fearful of acknowledging her authority outright, whispered among themselves that Austria had gained 2 rulers for the price of 1. Franz Joseph responded to her guidance with unwavering devotion. He revered Sophie. He feared disappointing her. He internalized her values so completely that the lines between his own will and hers blurred. To him, she was the embodiment of discipline, order, and imperial virtue. He once remarked, years later, that his mother's expectations felt heavier than any military decoration on his chest. Under her gaze, he became rigidly dutiful, punctual to the minute, ascetic in his habits, and incapable of allowing sentiment to interfere with governance. But Sophie's influence was not gentle. It was forged like steel. She demanded emotional restraint, insisting that an emperor could not afford to indulge in softness or vulnerability. She encouraged him to suppress fear, grief, and hesitation, to appear unshakable, even when the empire seemed to be cracking beneath his feet. She pushed him toward long working hours, meticulous record-keeping, and harsh expectations of himself and others. Franz Joseph's personality hardened accordingly. He became a ruler defined not by imagination or flexibility, but by unyielding routine and a belief that duty was the single highest virtue in life. This discipline, while making him a symbol of stability, also left him ill-equipped to understand emotion, his own or others. Nowhere was this more evident than in his marriage to Elizabeth of Bavaria, the famously free-spirited Sisi. Sophie had arranged the marriage believing that a young, unformed girl could be molded into the ideal Habsburg empress. But Sisi's independent spirit clashed violently with Sophie's worldview. Where Sophie saw duty, Sisi saw confinement. Where Sophie saw tradition, Sisi saw chains. Franz Joseph, caught between two opposing forces, leaned instinctively toward the mother who had shaped him. Sophie expected obedience from her daughter-in-law and received defiance. She expected gratitude and met resentment. And she expected the continuation of Habsburg discipline through the children she immediately took from Sisi's care, believing that their upbringing must be entrusted to someone who understood the weight of imperial responsibility. This decision carved a canyon between the two women that would never be bridged. As a mother, Sophie believed she was acting for the good of the empire. As a grandmother, she believed she was saving her grandchildren from the dangers of sentimentality. But to Sisi, it felt like an abduction of her motherhood, a rejection of her worth, and a declaration that she did not belong in the imperial court. Franz Joseph, for all his authority, could not reconcile the two women. He lacked the emotional vocabulary to mediate the conflict. His default response was silence, retreating into his office or his military duties rather than confronting the family war raging around him. In shaping her son into an ideal emperor, Sophie had inadvertently created a man emotionally isolated from those he loved. Franz Joseph admired loyalty but struggled to recognize suffering. He valued stability but failed to perceive the human cost of enforcing it. He believed that love, like governance, required discipline, and thus treated Sisi not as an equal partner, but as a figure expected to adapt, endure, and obey. Courtiers observed this dynamic with a mixture of awe and unease. They saw how Franz Joseph looked to his mother before making decisions, how he approached her counsel with reverence, and how her authority, though unofficial, carried more weight than many of the empire's ministers. Some praised her for creating a disciplined young ruler who could weather the storms of revolution. Others whispered that her influence had created a monarch too rigid for a world that was shifting beneath him. Yet for all the criticisms and admiration, one truth remained constant. Sophie had given the Habsburg Empire an emperor forged by her own hand. He was strong, dutiful, and unyielding, qualities the empire desperately needed. But he was also emotionally restrained, inwardly fragile, and increasingly isolated, qualities that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sophie believed she had done what history demanded of her. She believed she had saved the monarchy, But even she could not foresee that the steel she had hammered into her son would, in time, become both his greatest strength and his most tragic flaw. The marriage between Franz Joseph and Elizabeth of Bavaria, known to the world as Sisi, was meant to unite two branches of the Wittelsbach family. Instead, it ignited one of the coldest, most enduring conflicts in the history of the Habsburg court. Sophie had orchestrated the match, believing that a young, impressionable bride could be molded into the perfect imperial consort. What she received instead was a daughter-in-law whose spirit was too wild, too poetic, and too resistant to the rigid structures of the Viennese palace. Their personalities were not merely different, they were opposites. Sophie, disciplined, pragmatic, and rooted in duty, while Sisi was restless, melancholic, and deeply attached to her personal freedom. From the moment Sisi arrived in Vienna at the age of 16, it became clear that she was unprepared for the suffocating rituals of imperial life. The palace was cold, the courtiers judgmental, and every gesture she made became the subject of scrutiny. Sophie, accustomed to upholding centuries of tradition, interpreted Sisi's discomfort as immaturity, not trauma. She believed the young empress needed firm guidance, and in her mind, no one was more qualified than herself. She began correcting Sisi's behavior, organizing her schedule, selecting her companions, and advising her on matters from wardrobe to state etiquette. Sisi, overwhelmed and already fragile, felt watched, judged, and slowly erased. The tension between them was polite on the surface, but roiling underneath. Sophie rarely raised her voice. She did not need to. Her authority was woven into the very fabric of the court, and every chamberlain, lady-in-waiting, and advisor understood that the Archduchess's expectations defined the rhythm of the palace. Sisi, meanwhile, discovered that even the walls murmured Sophie's influence. There was no space in which she could breathe freely, no sanctuary where she was not compared to her formidable mother-in-law. She began to develop severe anxiety, insomnia, and episodes of depression, conditions the court dismissed as weakness. The conflict reached its deepest point when Sisi gave birth to her first child, Archduchess Sophie, in 1855. The moment that should have bound the two women together, instead, hardened the distance between them. Sophie believed the upbringing of imperial heirs was too important to be left in the hands of a young mother she considered naive. Without consulting Sisi, she took full charge of the baby's education, nursery, caregivers, and even daily routines. The infant was moved into Sophie's apartments, and Sisi was allowed to see her child only during scheduled visits. Visits supervised by nurses loyal to the Archduchess. Sisi was devastated. She wrote in her diary that she felt a stranger to my own child, a guest in a palace where she was meant to be queen. Franz Joseph, shaped by a lifetime of obedience to his mother, stood paralyzed between the two women. He sympathized with Sisi's pain, but lacked the courage to oppose Sophie's authority. His silence deepened Sisi's despair and convinced her that the only place she truly held power was within herself. She began retreating from the court, seeking solace in long rides, poetry, and the open air, the only environments where Sophie's influence could not reach her. When Sisi's second daughter, Gisela, was born, the same pattern repeated. Sophie took control immediately, believing she was preserving the stability of the dynasty. But it was the birth of Sisi's first son, Crown Prince Rudolf, in 1858 that escalated their Cold War into something approaching open hostility. Sisi insisted on raising Rudolf herself, determined to break the cycle that had stripped her of her daughters. Sophie, however, believed even more strongly that a male heir's education must follow strict imperial discipline. Conflict erupted in letters, in whispered arguments, and in the tense silences of shared rooms. Rudolph's fragile temperament made the tension worse. He was intelligent, sensitive, and prone to anxiety, traits Sophie interpreted as defects that required stricter upbringing. Sisi saw them as signs of vulnerability, needing protection. The child became a battlefield. When Sisi threatened to leave Vienna altogether, taking Rudolph with her, the court erupted in panic. Sophie reluctantly stepped back, just enough to keep the peace. But the damage had already been done. Rudolph's relationship with both women would remain shaped by this early struggle, and the emotional fractures born in his childhood would haunt him into adulthood. Throughout these years, Sophie convinced herself that she was acting in the empire's best interest, preserving tradition and shielding the monarchy from instability. She believed she was rescuing her grandchildren from the softness she feared would weaken them. And in many ways, her intentions were sincere. But the consequence of her conviction was a young mother left aching for her children, a son caught between loyalty and love, and a palace divided by two visions of what an empress should be. To courtiers, the conflict between Sophie and Sisi became a defining feature of the era. They admired Sophie's strength, but whispered about her coldness. They adored Sisi's beauty, but worried about her fragility. And in the silent space between these two women, Franz Joseph, emperor of a vast empire yet powerless within his own family, struggled to reconcile the past that shaped him with the future he hoped to build. The Cold War between Sophie and Sisi was not marked by dramatic confrontation, but by small, devastating cuts. A nursery reassigned, a decision overridden, a child taken away, a young woman dismissed as irrelevant. It was a war Sophie believed she was winning. But history and her own family would reveal a different truth. For all her political influence, for all the ministers she guided and the emperors she shaped, Sophie remained, above everything, a mother. And it was motherhood, not statecraft, that delivered the deepest wounds of her life. Two of her sons, Maximilian and Karl Ludwig, carried within them echoes of her strength and her ambition. But they also inherited the vulnerabilities that life at court had intensified rather than healed. The tragedies that befell them were not sudden storms. They were long shadows cast over years, shadows Sophie sensed long before anyone else understood the danger. Maximilian, the younger brother of Franz Joseph, was the child in whom she recognized her own complexity most clearly. He was brilliant, curious, artistic, and possessed a sensitivity that made him beloved by friends and foreign dignitaries alike. Unlike Franz Joseph's rigid devotion to duty, Maximilian approached life with wonder, imagination, and a desire to create beauty wherever he went. He adored literature, natural sciences, and reformist ideas. He dreamed not only of ruling, but of improving the world. Sophie loved him for this light, yet feared it too. She recognized that such idealism, when placed inside a dynasty built on caution and hierarchy, could be dangerous. Over the years, she watched with growing anxiety as Maximilian drifted further from the stable world she tried to maintain. His posting as governor of Lombardy-Venetia exposed him to revolutionary currents he could neither suppress nor fully understand. His attempt at reforms, though sincere, alienated conservatives and failed to satisfy liberals. His charm opened doors, but his political naivete closed them again with equal speed. Sophie wrote him letters filled with gentle warnings, but Maximilian was too hopeful, too confident in humanity, to take them to heart. It was this hope, this belief in destiny, that ultimately drew him toward Mexico. When the French, seeking to reshape Latin America, proposed establishing a monarchy there with Maximilian as emperor. He accepted with the enthusiasm of a man convinced he had been chosen to bring order and enlightenment to a suffering land. Sophie was horrified. She sensed in her bones that this was not an opportunity, but a trap. The letters she sent him during those years were filled with dread. Warnings about unreliable allies, about the dangers of ruling a divided nation, about the fragility of a throne supported by foreign bayonets rather than native loyalty. Maximilian responded with optimism, insisting that he could unite Mexico with fairness and modern governance. But as months turned into years, the reality became impossible to ignore. French support weakened, Mexican resistance grew stronger, and the empire he dreamed of building began to crumble beneath him. Sophie felt every rumor, every report of unrest, like a tightening cord around her heart. When news reached Vienna that Maximilian had been captured by Republican forces, she collapsed. She withdrew from public view, pacing her rooms at night, praying with a desperation she had never shown even during the revolutions of 1848. The message that arrived in June 1867 ended the last fragment of hope she clung to. Maximilian had been executed by firing squad on a hillside in Querétaro. Sophie did not scream. She did not cry openly. Those who were with her that day recalled only her whisper. I knew this would happen, but God has been too cruel. The empire mourned. Franz Joseph was shattered. Cece wept for a brother-in-law she had loved dearly. But Sophie's grief was different, heavier, deeper, and impossible to express. She had raised a son with dreams larger than life, and watched the world destroy him for them. The loss of Maximilian did not stand alone. Her other son, Archduke Karl Ludwig, had long been a source of worry for Sophie. He lacked Maximilian's brilliance and Franz Joseph's discipline, and he vacillated between piety and impulsiveness. Though not destined for greatness, he was affectionate and earnest, qualities Sophie cherished. Yet fate had no mercy for him either. After traveling through the Middle East, he contracted typhoid fever. Some accounts suggest cholera, which ravaged him quickly. In 1870, at the age of only 52, he died. His death may not have carried the dramatic weight of Maximilian's execution, but for Sophie, it was another fracture in a heart that had already endured too much. She had raised sons for duty, for empire, for the demands of a dynasty built on iron tradition. But neither obedience nor brilliance had saved them. Maximilian had died fighting for an impossible dream. Karl Ludwig had died far from home, a victim of illness that could not be outrun. In the quiet of her chambers, once the nerve center of the Habsburg court, Sophie spoke less, prayed more, and carried the weight of 2 funerals in her silence. She had constructed an empire around discipline, willpower, and sacrifice. Yet the empire had taken from her what mattered most. Ministers continued to respect her. Courtiers continued to fear her. Franz Joseph continued to seek her counsel. But Sophie herself felt a shift. Power no longer interested her. Influence no longer comforted her. She had survived revolutions, political crises, and decades of court intrigue. But losing her sons destroyed something she could never rebuild. In the span of 3 years, Sophie had seen the future she imagined for her family collapse. Once the architect of emperors, she became the witness of their suffering. And in this transformation, from strategist to grieving mother, her humanity emerged with a clarity that history had too often obscured. The Iron Archduchess still stood, but her foundations had cracked. And from those cracks seeped a sorrow deeper than the empire she had spent her life defending. By the late 1860s, the Habsburg Empire, once the immovable pillar of Central Europe, had begun to show cracks that even Sophie, with all her discipline and foresight, could no longer ignore. She had spent decades shoring up the monarchy with willpower alone, believing that if Franz Joseph remained strong, the empire would remain intact. But history had begun to move in directions no single ruler could control. Sophie, who had always interpreted political instability as a moral failing, now found herself witnessing the slow, relentless unraveling of a world she had devoted her life to protecting. The catastrophe of 1866 struck like a thunderbolt. Austria's defeat in the Austro-Prussian War shattered its dominance in German affairs and exposed the military, bureaucratic, and ideological weaknesses Sophie had sensed but never fully articulated. For centuries, the Habsburgs had claimed leadership over German-speaking Europe. Now that prestige was gone, seized by the rising power of Prussia under Otto von Bismarck. The loss was not merely strategic, it was existential. Sophie understood that Austria had been expelled from the center of the German world, relegated to a secondary position in continental politics. The empire she had raised her son to defend had been humiliated. Franz Joseph took the defeat with outward stoicism, as he had been trained to do. But Sophie saw the strain in his eyes, the tightness in his voice, the silent guilt that settled on him like winter frost. He believed he had failed the dynasty. Sophie, though furious at the generals and statesmen who had mismanaged the war, could not shake the feeling that this defeat marked the beginning of a decline she had long feared. Wrapped in shawls, pacing the ornate halls of the Hofburg Palace, she whispered to one of her ladies-in-waiting, "We have lived too long on memory and pride." Yet the decline did not stop there. The empire's internal tensions grew sharper. Nationalist movements, Hungarian, Czech, Italian, Croatian, and more, demanded autonomy, recognition, and rights that the rigid imperial system had never been designed to grant. Sophie had always believed that unity could be imposed through discipline, but now the illusion of cohesion broke before her eyes. She watched Franz Joseph struggle to negotiate with groups that no longer feared the emperor and no longer revered the old Habsburg mystique. The compromise that followed, the Ausgleich of 1867, shook Sophie to her core. It created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, granting the Hungarians equal status with the Austrians. To many politicians, it was a pragmatic solution to save the empire from disintegration. To Sophie, it was capitulation. She viewed it as an admission of imperial weakness, an abdication of traditional authority, and a betrayal of centuries of Habsburg sovereignty. Her son, the emperor she had molded with such care, was now forced into partnership with a group she considered rebellious and unreliable. The new order symbolized a fracture she could neither mend nor accept. Sophie's letters from this period reveal a profound grief, not only for Maximilian, whose execution still haunted her every waking moment, but for the empire that seemed to be dissolving around her. She wrote with bitterness about the spirit of rebellion overtaking Europe, lamenting a world that no longer valued obedience, hierarchy, or the sacred continuity of dynastic rule. The very forces she had tried to hold at bay with discipline and willpower were now sweeping across the continent, unstoppable and indifferent to her sacrifices. Her relationships within the family also shifted. Cece, once a fragile young woman cowed by Sophie's authority, gained newfound status and influence after the Ausgleich. Beloved by the Hungarian nobility who adored her charm and emotional warmth. Where Sophie had failed to win hearts, Cece succeeded effortlessly. For the first time in her life, Sophie found herself overshadowed. The court's whispers changed. Admiration for Cece grew. while Sophie's authority quietly diminished. She watched Sisi become the symbolic bridge between Austria and Hungary, the very compromise Sophie despised. Yet she no longer had the strength to oppose it. Even Franz Joseph, despite his enduring devotion, began relying less on his mother and more on ministers who understood the demands of the changing era. Sophie felt the shift keenly, though she never resented her son for it. She knew he was carrying burdens no human being could sustain alone. Still, the distance wounded her. She had shaped him into an emperor perfectly suited for the old world. But now the old world was vanishing. By the turn of the decade, Sophie saw the cracks in the empire as reflections of the cracks within herself. She had spent a lifetime believing that discipline could conquer chaos, that structure could subdue uncertainty, and that sacrifice could fend off decline. But now she understood a harsher truth, that even the strongest structures eventually age, even the most loyal sons eventually change, and even the greatest empires eventually falter under the weight of time. She wandered palace corridors more slowly. She sat longer in chapels, her rosary clutched in trembling hands. She paused at windows overlooking Vienna, a city she had once ruled through sheer presence, and watched carriages roll along streets filled with languages from every corner of the empire. Languages she feared would one day drift apart, as her own family had. Her world had not collapsed in a single moment of catastrophe. It was eroding, quietly, steadily, like a coastline swallowed by an unrelenting tide. Sophie had fought revolutions, shaped emperors, and defied the limitations placed on her as a woman in a man's court. But now she faced an enemy she could not outmaneuver, the slow death of the world she had built her life around. And in that realization lay the most painful truth of all, that she had lived long enough to see the beginning of the end. In the final years of her life, Sophie became a figure transformed, not by politics or power, but by grief. The woman who had once dominated the imperial court with steely discipline now moved through the palace like a shadow of her former self, quieter, slower, and carrying a sorrow so deep that those around her feared interrupting it. She who had once waged battles against revolution, ministers, and even her own daughter-in-law, now fought only one enemy: memory. And memory, unlike politics, could not be subdued by intellect or will. After Maximilian's execution in 1867, something inside Sophie broke in a way that could not be repaired. She had lost children before. Her little daughter Maria Anna had died young. But the death of a grown son, a son she had raised with such care and ambition, struck her with a pain that seemed to hollow her from within. The newspapers reported the tragedy with formal distance. Diplomats sent condolences, and the court entered a period of mourning. But none of these gestures touched the core of her loss. Sophie withdrew. She began refusing audiences, canceling social engagements, and declining invitations to events she once attended with unshakable poise. Her chambers became a sanctuary of silence, where visitors entered softly and left more softly still. Her grief was not loud. It was suffocating. Servants spoke of finding her seated in a chair for hours, hands clasped, gaze fixed on nothing visible. Her rosary, once a tool of disciplined prayer, became an object she clutched like a lifeline. She attended Mass frequently, lingering in chapels long after services ended, whispering prayers that felt more like confessions of pain than petitions for comfort. The Archduchess, who had once counseled emperors, now sought counsel only from God. And even then, she often found no answer. Despite her withdrawal, fragments of her former self remained. She still followed political events through newspapers, though now with dread instead of determination. Every headline about unrest in Hungary, conflict in the Balkans, or nationalist agitation in Bohemia confirmed her fear that the empire she had devoted her life to strengthening was slowly disintegrating. She had spent decades trying to hold together a mosaic of nations bound by tradition, dynasty, and discipline. Yet now she watched that mosaic crack along every seam. She blamed no one publicly, but in the privacy of her thoughts, she saw Maximilian's death as a symbol of something larger, a divine punishment, a cosmic injustice, or perhaps the final proof that empires were mortal. She had lived long enough to see revolutions erupt, wars lost, thrones threatened, and territories slip away. She had witnessed the rise of liberal movements she despised, the decline of aristocratic power she cherished, and the ascendance of nations that challenged the Habsburg world order. Every change in Europe seemed like another nail in the coffin of the dynasty she had spent her life defending. Her relationship with Franz Joseph remained close, but grew tinged with melancholy. The emperor visited her regularly, speaking softly, sitting beside her longer than protocol required. He loved her deeply, aware that she had made him into the man he was. And yet their conversations often drifted toward memories rather than the present. He rarely spoke of Maximilian. Sophie's grief made the topic too raw. But he sensed that every time his brother's name appeared in the newspapers, Sophie's wounds reopened. He saw how the once indomitable Archduchess now needed support simply to walk across her chambers. The woman who had shaped his destiny now depended on his presence to ease the endless ache of loss. Cece, too, visited her mother-in-law more frequently during these years. Their relationship, once defined by tension and conflict, softened under the weight of shared sorrow. Both women had lost children. Both understood that grief left marks deeper than politics or pride. Cece, who had long resisted Sophie's authority, now approached her with compassion. Aware that age and pain had carved out a gentler version of the sharp-edged matriarch she once feared. Their conversations were never intimate, but the hostility between them faded into something calmer, quieter, almost tender. Sophie's daily routines shrank to simple rituals: prayer, short walks through the palace gardens, visits to the tombs of her children, and hours spent in silence. Gardens that had once been places of strategy, where she had walked with ministers discussing political crises, became places of mourning. She paused by fountains, touched the bark of old trees, and lingered by rose bushes that reminded her of happier summers when her children were young and alive. Each corner of the garden held a memory she had no strength to resist. She became increasingly frail. Illnesses that once would have barely troubled her now lingered, aggravating her physical and emotional exhaustion. Her ladies-in-waiting often saw her pause mid-step, gripping a wall or a chair, as if the weight of memory alone hindered her movement. Yet she rarely complained. Stoicism had been her armor in youth. Now it was her last shield in old age. The empire continued to evolve around her. Newspapers spoke of political reforms, ethnic tensions, and the shifting balance of power in Europe. Sophie read these news with the resignation of someone who knew her battle was long over. She no longer tried to steer events, nor did she scold Franz Joseph for compromises she once would have condemned. Instead, she watched the world through the eyes of a woman who had loved a dynasty too deeply, fought for it too fiercely, and suffered for it more than anyone would ever fully understand. In these final years, Sophie was not the Iron Matriarch of the Habsburgs. She was a mother haunted by loss, a widow in spirit if not in name, and a witness to the slow death of the empire she had given everything to preserve. Her power had faded, her influence had waned, but her sorrow remained, a constant echoing presence in the silent corridors of the Hofburg. She had shaped history, but history had broken her. And in that quiet tragedy lay the most human truth of her entire life. By the dawn of the 1870s, Sophie had become a figure almost mythic within the Viennese court. An archduchess whose influence had once shaped governments, silenced ministers, and forged emperors, yet who now drifted quietly through the palace like a relic of a bygone age. Her presence still carried dignity, but the commanding aura she had once worn so effortlessly had dissolved into something gentler, more fragile. Courtiers bowed to her with the same reverence they always had, but behind their respectful gestures was a collective awareness. The empire's iron matriarch was fading. Her health had begun to worsen steadily. The grief she carried in her chest, layer upon layer of sorrow for Maximilian, for Karl Ludwig, for the empire she felt slipping away, had weakened her body in ways physicians could not mend. Chronic illnesses crept in, quietly at first, then with a numbing regularity that confined her to her apartments for long stretches of time. She suffered from difficulty breathing, bouts of fever, and bone-deep exhaustion that left her unable to walk without assistance. Yet, true to her nature, she bore each ailment with stoic restraint. Complaints were beneath her. Pain was simply another burden to be carried with dignity. Visitors to her chambers during these months remembered the dim light filtering through heavy curtains, the quiet ticking of clocks, and the faint smell of incense from the chapel, where she now spent much of her time. Sophie received them seated in an armchair rather than standing. But her back remained straight, her expression composed. Even weakened, she projected an aura of authority. But the conversations were different now. Less about politics, more about remembrance. She asked after her grandchildren, inquired gently about Franz Joseph's health, and occasionally allowed herself to speak the names she had avoided for years. Maximilian, Karl Ludwig, and the children she had lost long ago. Whenever she did, her voice wavered only slightly, but the room grew still, as if the air itself bowed in respect to her pain. Franz Joseph visited her often during these final months. Their meetings were quieter than in the past. There were no political discussions, no counsel to offer, no decisions to shape. Instead, the emperor sat beside his mother and held her hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in their younger years. Sophie allowed it now. She leaned into his presence with the tenderness she had rarely shown in earlier decades. He, in turn, cherished these visits, aware that the woman who had guided him from childhood, the figure who had been both anchor and architect of his life, was slipping away. Sometimes they sat in silence, the unspoken bond between them stronger than words. Other times, Sophie spoke softly about the past, about the Bavaria of her youth, about the early years of her marriage, or about the challenges she had once faced with unshakable resolve. It was not lost on Franz Joseph that his mother's passing would mark not only a personal loss, but also the end of an era. Sophie represented the last unbroken link to the old imperial world, the world before revolutions, before modern reforms, before the empire's fractures became impossible to ignore. Her life had spanned one of the most tumultuous periods in European history, and her influence had shaped the monarchy's survival through its darkest moments. Her death would symbolize more than the passing of an archduchess. It would be the symbolic fading of the empire's old soul. Sisi too visited Sophie more often in these final months. Their relationship, long tense and fraught with conflict, had softened into something resembling mutual recognition. Sisi no longer feared Sophie's judgment, and Sophie no longer expected obedience. In their quiet conversations, they found a fragile understanding rooted in shared sorrow rather than rivalry. Both had lost children. Both had lived under the crushing weight of imperial expectations. Both had discovered that power offered no protection against tragedy. In a strange way, grief had accomplished what politics never could. It made them almost kin. As spring turned to early summer in 1872, Sophie's strength declined rapidly. Her doctors reported that she suffered from fluid buildup, heart troubles, and episodes of delirium that left her confused and frightened. Symptoms that terrified the court. Not because they were unusual for someone of her age, but because they stripped Sophie of the clarity and control that had defined her life. There were days when she recognized no one. Days when she called out for Maximilian. Days when she stared at the ceiling, whispering prayers. On May 28, 1872, as dawn broke over Vienna, Sophie's breathing slowed. Franz Joseph had visited her late into the previous evening, leaving only when she insisted he rest. When word came that her condition had worsened, it was already too late for him to return in time. Surrounded by attendants and clergy, Sophie slipped away quietly, her passing marked not by drama, but by a soft, final exhale, fitting for a woman who had lived her final years in silence. The news spread through Vienna before midday. Bells tolled. Black drapery was hung across palace windows. Newspapers published solemn tributes acknowledging her political insight, her unshakable discipline, and the extraordinary influence she wielded without ever wearing a crown. But no article captured the full scope of her life. To some, she was the savior of the monarchy. To others, its stern jailer. To Franz Joseph, she was the mother who forged him. To Maximilian, she had been both compass and warning. And to history, she remained a paradox, the most powerful woman in the empire who never held a formal title. Her funeral was dignified, but not grandiose. Sophie had requested simplicity, perhaps the only simplicity she had ever allowed in her life. As her coffin was lowered into the imperial crypt, those present whispered the same truth. With her death, an era had ended. The empire she had spent her life shaping would survive her for only a few decades more. But the seeds of its fate, its strength, its fractures, its losses, were all entwined with her legacy. Sophie left the world as she had lived in it, disciplined, resolute, and deeply human beneath the layers of imperial steel. Archduchess Sophie's life stands as one of the great paradoxes of imperial history. She shaped a dynasty without ever holding a title, forged an emperor without ever wearing a crown, and protected an empire with a devotion so absolute that it consumed nearly everything else within her reach. She believed in duty more than affection, in discipline more than comfort, in the permanence of the Habsburg world more than the fragile needs of the human heart. And yet, the forces she tried hardest to control, history, grief, and change, were the very ones that ultimately unraveled both her family and the empire she cherished. Her brilliance preserved the monarchy at its most vulnerable moment. Her iron will carried Franz Joseph through revolution. Her clarity saw dangers others refused to acknowledge. But power, even when wielded silently, is a blade with two edges. The same discipline that built her son into a ruler also created emotional distances he never fully bridged. The same sense of duty that held the empire together pushed away the daughter-in-law who yearned for kindness. The same devotion that guided Maximilian could not save him from the fatal idealism she feared. And the empire she fought so fiercely to guard began to crumble long before her death. In the end, Sophie died surrounded not by triumph, but by silence. She outlived the children she loved, outlived the political world she understood, and outlived the illusion of Habsburg invincibility. Her story reminds us that even the strongest figures, those who bend history with their will, remain vulnerable to the quiet devastations that power cannot prevent. Empires fall, children stray. Time erodes what certainty builds. But Sophie's legacy endures in a more human way. She was a woman who dared to act in a world that denied her authority, whose intellect outshone the expectations placed upon her, and whose determination shaped an entire age. She stands as a testament to the unseen power women often held in the shadows of monarchies, and to the cost they paid for carrying responsibilities that were never meant to be theirs alone. Her life is both a monument and a warning that greatness rarely comes without sacrifice, and that even those who hold the reins of an empire cannot escape the tragedies of the heart.